From DLA Piper, this is the Beyond the Curve podcast. In this episode, DLA Piper's Ehab Elsonbaty and former US Congressman Patrick Murphy discuss the growing investment ties between the Middle East and Miami, from sports and travel to real estate.
My name is Ehab Elsonbaty. I'm a partner in the global law firm DLA Piper, and I'm the chair of the US Middle East Initiative in the firm.
I'm Patrick Murphy, former U.S. Congressman representing Florida's 18th District, which is the Palm Beach area of Florida, and now work at a family construction business that has 2 AI companies in the construction technology space.
We are very pleased to have you with us, Patrick. We would like to discuss a very interesting topic, which is the relevance and the relationships that is going to be developed between the Middle East and Miami, with a specific focus on the GCC countries. But let's start first with context of Miami versus investments in general. Miami has long been an attractive destination for tourists, celebrities, and cultural enthusiasm. And now the Magic City is one of the world's top destinations for business investments across a variety of sectors. We hear about sports, real estate, transportation, luxury brands. What is driving this interest, Patrick?
I'm biased because I grew up in South Florida, so I've always thought Miami was a wonderful city to live and grow. When I think folks from around the world, and specifically GCC, thought of the United States, they often thought of LA, New York. Miami really wasn't in the conversation until recently. And with COVID, I think we saw a lot of trends get sped up a bit. The push and surge into South Florida is one of those, right? It was already happening. We already had a bit of a boom in South Florida real estate, but COVID sped it up. And seeing it from the construction lens, there's so much new work and high-end luxury product coming online in the next couple of years. So that's an exciting place for us all to be in, because the city dynamic is really stepping up. There's better restaurants, there's better arts, there's better music, the amenities in the buildings that you're seeing, the caliber of people in conversation and diversity in their backgrounds. Everything is being elevated right now in South Florida. So definitely an exciting place. They're adding more and more direct flights to GCC countries. Every few months, I read about something new coming online. And let's face it, there's an opportunity to make money. When you have all of that interest, I think that presents opportunities for folks in real estate to really see that they can invest their dollars here and not only enjoy being there, but get a real good return on it. We have a friendly tax environment. We have a pro-business government, and that's a good recipe for growth.
I have seen this kind of elevation in many sectors in Miami. But what about the critical infrastructure of the city? You just opened my appetite to ask this question before diving into the specific Middle East piece. Generally speaking, from transportation, from roads, from traffic, from urban planning, do you see the city able to play this role? Would the infrastructure be able to present for the comers to Miami in its new role as an investment destination what LA and New York is able to offer?
Look, I'd say it's getting there. It is still a young city compared to some of the ones that you just mentioned. And I think like a lot of growing cities, there hasn't been enough of a prioritization on the infrastructure. The extra complexity in South Florida and Miami in particular is climate change and natural disasters that we're prone to. I think you bring up a great point. While it's scary to think about, it does create an opportunity. And there's some really interesting proposals out there to use some natural landscapes to help prepare South Florida for what we all see is happening with climate change and better protect all of us. So I hope we continue to encourage political leadership on both sides of the aisle to make the necessary investments and don't wait until it's too late. But everything from our water, our sewer, power lines being underwater, the roads, the pumps, building heights, all need to be addressed.
Let's then move to the Middle East. We have seen more than one of the famous GCC airlines operating a daily operation from the Middle East to Miami. We have seen a high increase in demand of our clients from the Middle East into different sectors. They are visiting the city, they are coming to attend all sorts of events and conferences. Many large entity and event organizers are having their signature events in Miami. Therefore, many of the key players are coming to attend, and there is a movement towards investments in different sectors. Do you think this is happening as Middle Eastern investors are similar to all other investors that are now attracted to Miami, or there is some other elements that you can consider that is encouraging the Middle Eastern investors more than the other types of investors that are coming or attracted to South Florida and Miami specifically?
I think there are a lot of similarities. Number one, generally oceanfront property. Number two, seen as a safe haven for investments in real estate, where over the last 20, 30 plus years, you've seen the steady increase in valuations. I think pros and cons to both that you could argue from a macroeconomic standpoint, but there's good arguments to be made that both are good places to invest in real estate if you have a long-term perspective on the cities. I haven't spent as much time in the Middle East as you, but had an opportunity to spend a decent amount of time, and a lot of similar restaurants, a lot of the similar lounges and stores, hotel brands, amenities that you're seeing. So I think there's a comfort level when you can go from one city to the next and know basically exactly what you're getting and the level of service and food quality, et cetera. There's that comfort. Again, having the direct flights. I also think there's something to be said about having a critical mass of people that you know, where you go to another city and you're going to bump into 3 or 4 friends. It helps you feel like you're home. It helps you feel like you belong there. And Miami really didn't have that community until recently.
I agree with you coming from there, having lived 30 years of my life and experience back there. There is this kind of feel and the spirit that is shared between Miami and GCC countries. Let's focus on the industries that you're hearing that they are more attractive to the Middle Eastern investors. Are they similar to the other investor, or they are a little bit different for Middle Eastern investors? I would like to know if you have seen different types of investors. Are they mostly individuals? Are they mostly family offices, investment companies, sovereign funds?
From a high level, I'd say a lot of the real estate investment in South Florida to date has been as LPs, a little bit more passive, investing with a group of people, some developers they might know, and getting those returns. I think that's generally been the trend for GCC community from an investment standpoint. But we're starting to see a shift, and there are some big names from Dubai, UAE, for example, that have bought property and developing on their own as the GP, right, as the developer, some very high-end oceanfront real estate. So I think one starts that momentum, and I would fully expect there to be more and more developers from Dubai and Miami being very similar names and starting to bring attributes from both places and helping grow that community of investors and folks that want to be in both cities because they're both great climates, they're both great atmospheres for business, et cetera. So I expect to see more of that.
What are the key legal and regulatory terms or landmarks that would be different in Miami than other legal frameworks in other states that the foreign investor should be aware of?
The biggest one that's unique is the condo liability laws are very stringent here in Florida, where there is basically a 10-year tail once a building is built, where the association, the homeowners or residents of that condominium can sue the developer, the architect, the engineer, the contractor, et cetera, and they can go after them. And there's a series they call defects for the buildings that they will often go after. Maybe it's a waterproofing issue, maybe it's the level of a stair, maybe it's a code issue. And if not addressed correctly, these can be pretty big numbers we're talking about. So what a lot of firms do is address this head on. You expect it to happen. It's in the pro forma. You know it's going to happen, and you prepare for it. For investors, I would tell them to be aware of that, make sure it's in the pro forma, make sure they have the right counsel to prepare them for that. Outside of that, I think Florida's fairly pro-business, pretty straightforward. There are certain rules for condo developers and real estate developers of how they can use deposits of buyers and when they can use those deposits, right? There's different thresholds that have to be met for when you break ground, when you top out a building, and then you can take those investor deposits and use them. What that amounts to is basically financing from your sales and not from the bank. So it really changes the game. And if you think about it, again, from a macro level in South Florida, we have continued to build thousands of condos over the last couple of years, despite the high interest rates, because it's not really an impact, because there's not a lot of lending needed for these condominiums. Meanwhile, during that same period of time, we've seen the apartments and multifamily dramatically slow down because it's so sensitive to interest rate fluctuations. So condos kept going because you could rely on investor money, basically, and those sales, that money to fund the building and the construction. Now that interest rates are coming down, we're starting to see the multifamily pick back up. So hopefully that will adjust. I think that's a sustainable community to have a mix of both.
Let's stay with legal and regulatory expectations because this is important. How do you see the generally mindset and the regulatory system in Miami in terms of receiving foreign investments into the state?
Generally, I think we've been very open-minded toward those investments, especially in Miami, as you mentioned, more so than many other parts of the state. There have been some groups of people that have been basically banned from investing in certain groups of real estate throughout Florida. It hasn't been GCC countries, but there have been groups, and there are certain parts of the state that are interpreting that a little bit differently than Miami. Miami's always been diverse. So I think it welcome with open arms. Our mayor in Miami has spent a lot of time in the GCC, made a lot of friends, really helped promote the city. As far as the national laws go, you could probably speak to that better. And I think most people are aware of those different foreign investment rules that are out there.
I think you're referring to the memorandum that was signed by the Dubai mayor or governor and Miami, which I think there are some steps to action and start implementing it, especially there are so many similarities between the two beautiful cities. And it is fantastic to understand from you that the environment, the ecosystem is welcoming foreign investments. Nothing worries our clients or our partners or our friends coming from the GCC or the Middle East than a nervous system scrutinizing every single thing that they do, but rather a welcoming, enabling system that allows them really to expand, explore opportunities, and invest as they go. And I have to admit that I have seen this remarkably in the firm's event when we hosted an event between the US investments and the GCC and the Middle East, and the support that we have seen from different authorities on different levels in South Florida, where people were very keen to attend, participate positively, answer all the questions, and follow up even with our guests and clients who were visiting from abroad.
Miami has a history, really, even though it's a short history relative to other cities, of welcoming many different groups as residents and investors. We've had surges of groups from Europe, and oftentimes because of currency exchanges, Russians, South American, Central American, and now GCC, I'd say, is the next group that's really starting to take a lot of pride in South Florida investing.
What about the other remaining pieces to complete the ecosystem in terms of health system, education system, and other stuff that long-term investors will be looking at? I think there are two terms that are always walking together side to side: talents and capital. Both of them have to exist together. You will not see talents without capital or capital without talents. What you can tell us about the ecosystem to welcome the talents that will be working on these investments on the short and on the long term?
You've seen some great private schools from New York and other places moving as well down to South Florida, opening up for grade school, middle school, high schools, which is good. And in the healthcare side, you've seen not only an expansion of some of the existing chains that we have, but some of the bigger brand names that folks would know from around the country and the world, for that matter, looking to establish a footprint here in South Florida. I think Miami's come a long way, but there's no doubt that cities like New York and Chicago and LA are more mature. They've got a bit more depth in many places. So it's great to see those institutions from those cities coming down. I think that adds to the sense of warmth that if an investor, if someone wants to buy an apartment or buy a condo, that they feel that not only their friends there, but their health provider is going to be there, a school they're familiar with, maybe their grandkids going to, or whatever it is. It helps foster that community feeling.
What are other changes that you have seen in the economy of Miami? You know better how the economy was dependent on certain resources for some time, and now this thing is transforming to different diversified resources. How did Miami become such fruitful soil for international business expansion?
Miami has always been known for tourism and real estate. That's been a staple, and I think that continues. However, to your point, we have really diversified the economy here recently. Number one, with finance. There are some major institutions from, again, around the world and around the country that are establishing a headquarters here with 1,000+ people. And if you bring 1,000 people down, that means the law firms come down. That means the accounting firms, the IT firms, all of the support groups are coming with them. So that's a big deal. And you're seeing headquarters or HQ2 being located in South Florida. The average salaries in a lot of these groups that we're seeing come down are 5x what we've seen in South Florida. So all of a sudden you have 1,000 people making 5x more than historically was the norm for Miami. That's only going to prop up the real estate market. So it goes back to propping up real estate, which has always been a staple here in South Florida. But also, not only is it finance, it's the technology scene. And you've seen some really big name tech groups from San Francisco, the Silicon Valley, some of the staples around the world, and certainly in California, moving headquarters to South Florida. And again, these are very good paying jobs. With them comes a development group of folks, and the educational programs in the local universities are changing. There's now artificial intelligence degrees in a lot of the universities locally. They're starting to change the degrees for a lot of other technical opportunities. So that's a huge thing for South Florida, where the jobs aren't just relying on tourism and real estate, because if and when the next downturn is, those two things usually are pretty affected. Technology and finance can help offset that and help us create a more sustainable and manageable economy. I don't expect that to change in the near future. We've seen a lot of great groups come in, continue to hear about new offices opening in South Florida.
Amazing. And back again to the talent, Patrick. How do you see the talents being generated into that ecosystem and the relevant jobs to them? Florida in general has been always the home of very amazing schools and universities. What are your observations in terms of talents and jobs within this investment ecosystem?
There's no doubt that the local community has benefited from this, but I would say a lot of the talents that you're alluding to, both finance and tech, have been imported from other places. And I think, like anything, it's going to take time for that community to get built. And if you look at technology, something that I spend most of my time in now, in order to really get that tech community going, not only do you need the investment in those venture capital firms, for example, coming in, which we're seeing, but then you're going to need some successful companies. And then from those successful companies that are maybe born in South Florida, that have developers and workforces, eventually they get sold. And then all of a sudden there's some folks with some more money there that maybe start investing more and start funding more companies. And that pyramid starts to develop. But if you look at Silicon Valley, it didn't happen overnight. And the workers that are needed there, we don't necessarily have the same schools that California does. We're getting there. It's going to take time. So you have to import some of that talent in the meantime. But it is happening. Look, there's all sorts of things that we could talk about here. But something that's critical for this question, I think, is the affordability. Miami has to continue, as does every city, focusing on workforce and affordable housing, making sure that if folks do want to live and work here, that they can afford it and that they can be in a place that's close to their job and that there's a school that their kids can afford to go to. So back to that infrastructure conversation we had, the workforce housing is critical because we're seeing a lot of high-end real estate, not as much of that lower end. So we really need to help incentivize the government to do this and the developers to focus on this part of the market.
As we stand now, Patrick, how do you see the investment outlook on Miami? From us as a law firm, we have seen a demand on real estate in Miami and in Palm Beach. We have seen fantastic deals being done in the tourism sector and the hospitality sector. This is what Miami was built on and famous for. Agreed with you, many financial institutions and asset management and so on. No wonder that people like us who are professionals here in New York are spending now more time in Miami than before to match the demand of our clients and the necessary existence for us to be there with them in their deals or in their events or their negotiations. But having seen all of that in all your capacities currently as one of the very significant businessmen and as a politician and as a Miamian overall, how do you see the outlook in the coming 5 years? Which sectors will thrive? Which sectors will face headwinds and why?
So I, again, think that tourism and real estate has the biggest roots and the deepest roots in South Florida. So I think that will continue to thrive. I think real estate continues to grow. There's quite a few exciting projects. As I mentioned earlier, quite a few exciting headquarters and big offices and major employers coming to South Florida. So if we can combine that with the correct infrastructure, which includes housing and hospitals and education and climate change issues that need to be addressed, right? If we can balance that, we're very well positioned for growth. I am hopeful that South Florida becomes Wall Street South, as some people have coined. I think that takes time. You've seen a lot of folks come down to South Florida for obvious reasons during COVID and taxes. But what we've also seen, Ehab, is a bifurcation in the communities where maybe those senior level executives are able to afford South Florida and have that high-end luxury condo and that high-end lifestyle. But a lot of the more mid-level to junior level employees are staying in a place like New York or Chicago. And I would say the same with the tech sector. There were some big name groups that did come down to South Florida and have decided to close their office in Miami and go back to where they were because there wasn't enough of a community there. I would look at it like we had a big step up. I think it's going to plateau. I think there'll be more step ups, but I don't think we could or should expect it to be this linear increase in companies, whether they're major finance companies or technology, and it's just going to keep rising at this crazy rate. It's not sustainable. So I fully expect it to plateau, which I think is what we're going through now, but I think that's healthy. We have to absorb everything that came to South Florida. So I think when we look back in 5 or 10 years and compare that to where we were in 2020 or even where we're at today, you're going to see more growth.
And I have to add a little bit of challenge here, Patrick, because I have seen this trend, attending events, meeting clients, increasing. In the last year, I know many of my connections and friends who started going back again here in New York, maybe other cities, because of several reasons. Many of them were working from home and institutions called them and told them,
come on back.
There are offices that we have to occupy. What are your views in this regard? Was it only a trend that has brought all of these people to Miami, or it is significant ecosystem that was enabling, ready to host and accommodate, and therefore many of those who came during the COVID decided to remain or in the search of opportunities that allows them to remain or to return back to Miami and achieve this kind of equalization after a little bit?
I think we have a new norm in South Florida. We have a new plateau or floor that we've established. So yes, you might have some people going back to their normal work environment because they've been called back or leave for various family reasons, whatever it might be. But generally speaking, I believe that we have a new floor here where a lot of the businesses that moved are going to stay. A lot of the businesses that came down are going to continue to bring their supporting businesses down. I think the more people that are exposed to life in South Florida and Miami are going to see all the attributes that it has to offer and the great quality of life. So yes, I think like you said, and as I alluded to, there have been some companies to go back. There have been some people to go back. But generally speaking, I think it's this step up that I mentioned. We had a big step up. Maybe there's a plateau, but I think there'll be other step ups to come. I don't think this is the end of the story. And I think there's still plenty of room to grow.
Patrick, this is very promising. I'm also a big fan and a big supporter of Miami and South Florida, and would love to see more of that. Let's flip the coin and put it on your side. Any other points that you would like to share or discuss?
I think another exciting opportunity in South Florida is sports. We've always had football and baseball and basketball here, but now we've got F1 and soccer and some major stars. Professional tennis is growing, continue to get more and more major sporting events. So I think that's a nice dynamic that everyone appreciates. And no doubt GCC appreciates things like F1 and soccer, which is a nice new element for us to have, a new offering for us to have. Continued expansion of Art Basel and some of the arts programs, the boat shows in Miami and Fort Lauderdale are some of the biggest in the world venues. And you've got other groups like this that are continuing to come and grow. I think all of that helps create this community dynamic and round out South Florida from just tourism or just real estate, where now there's a bit more to offer. So that's all exciting. As I've traveled to GCC region, there's of course a huge focus there, whether it's UAE or Qatar or Saudi. You see tremendous investments in leadership in artificial intelligence. I think a lot of countries should take note. AI is going to transform the world like no one can probably predict. I'm focused on it in my industry in construction and real estate. So I think that's another nice cross section where Miami has this growing tech sector. GCC has a growing tech sector. That's a nice opportunity for us to learn together as we grow. Neither one of us are Silicon Valley, but we're trying, we're getting there. The political leadership is there. A lot of the investors are there. So let's foster that together. I think we have some exciting things to work on together.
Patrick, I should really end by thanking you very much for your very important insights. I learned a lot, and I think many of our listeners will be very much interested in what you had to say. We hope to continue the discussions, and I agree with you. The future really looks bright as amazing weather of Miami towards investments opportunities, specifically coming from the Middle East and the GCC. Thank you very much again for your time, and thank you very much for our listeners and followers.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on the program.
Thank you for listening to DLA Piper's Beyond the Curve podcast. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper, LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper, LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.